You're tuned to 1520 WCAT Radio, and it's time now for the Avid Reader Show with your host, Sam Hankin. Sam will offer reviews and interviews of some of the more interesting books and authors of today, and now Sam Hankin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. I know I've said it for the last couple of times, but we just won the award for Best Bookshop in Philadelphia, and we also won an award for the Best Coffee Shop on the Main Line. So we're real pleased with that, and it's great to have with us today Stanley Warren, who's a frequent visitor to the shop and a prolific author who may not be known by everybody. He's not going to be on the front table of the bestsellers, but only probably because I think he's chosen not to be, because I think his work is as good or better than most of the stuff we sell regularly in the store. So,
well,
Stan,
thank you.
You're welcome. Welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So, let's talk a little bit about, we're going to talk about your poetry, which is close to your heart today, but let's talk a little bit about your background, how you became a writer, and some of your history, because it's, incredibly fascinating. But since you'll go on and on, I will have to interrupt you from time to time.
Done.
Okay. So you go ahead.
Well, it started when I guess my mother singing or just listening to words and knowing that they rhymed and being fascinated by them, that you could rhyme words and manipulate language, and then without getting too psychological, the notion that you have a certain power when you write. This is a world where you are not, again, sounding like a megalomaniac, but in essence, you're like God. This is your creation, and that's very liberating to a child who is beset by externals of which he has no control.
Well, so how old were you when you first had this actual realization in your mind that what you were doing was reading and what these words were words?
Well, not so much that, but what triggered things, I read an article in a Reader's Digest, and it was one of those first-person experiences. A man went hunting in North Carolina, and there was a full moon. They were in a blind with their rifles. A deer stepped into a clearing, bathed in this moonlight, and the hunter who shot it couldn't take the shot. And the other one said, "I understand," he said, "angels walk in the moonlight too." I was so struck by that phrase, the intensity of it, and we can get back to that intensity generation. I wrote a poem. It ended, he said this to me, and I'll say it to you, yes, angels walk in the moonlight too. My mother was very proud. She snatched up the poem. I've never seen it again.
Well, so that's how you started with poetry then?
Yes, I did.
And that's, like I said at the outset, kind of closest to your heart?
Yes, and I wrote about, a handful of poems in one of those grade school composition books with the black and the white modeling on it. Then in my college days, I wrote unsuccessful imitations of Goethe's Faust, and really went along until my late 20s when I had one of those triggering experiences that launched me into poetry.
Well, why don't we take the time now then why don't you read a couple of the ones you like the best, some of the shorter ones, so we can continue with our conversation.
Well, as far as inspiration is concerned, I was working in the corporate center in Great Valley, and I got, for a while, a window office, and outside the window office were this line of birch trees, and they were so beautiful. I knew I would write a poem about them, and yet it literally took 2 years before I did. It's called White Bark. Stripped of their leaves by an unrelenting wind, the birches shine like sunlit snow, a hint of winter still to come, belied by cloudless sky, rippling grass, careless flight of birds. No words can capture bark's white glow, bathing my eyes with rapture so intense it remains unseen. All I know is that I love those trees, mute witnesses of a world made pure by sheen.
That's great. Read another one.
Driving to the corporate center, saw in the sky some geese flying. They usually fly either in a group, undefined, or a V or an oblique line. But in this case, there were geese flying one after the other, which was so striking I counted them. Not very safe, but it was early in the morning, no traffic. And then the phrase, or the two words came into my mind, goose necklace. And that's where poetry comes from. And we can maybe talk about that in a minute. Goose necklace. What invisible hand strung 40 geese on an unseen wire, drawn through the sky so smoothly you would think them one? Birds for beads on a necklace so long it fits no neck, but wraps itself snug round my marveling brain, a piece of work no one can explain.
Well, so when you see these things, when you see these objects, and you're thinking in your head, well, normally they're in a V or they're unorganized, and you see this, what gives rise in your mind to the need to express it in language rather than just enjoying and experiencing? It's like people who have video cameras and they videotape half their life and you think they're going to watch the other half. What gives rise to your need, and we talked about it a little bit before, to let it all out?
The French author André Gide defined a writer, and this actually applies to any of the arts, music, painting. He said a writer is someone who is incapable of not writing. And as to what puts that in there to begin with, it's various things. But I was incapable of not writing.
Yeah, I know. When I was in college, and I'm this frustrated novelist, I write, but as I said to you, exposition, narrative, dialogue I can write, but I can't come up with a story about all this stuff. And I asked my professor, William Goldhurst, whose father, I think it was Harry Golden, who wrote History of the Lost Generation. And in any event, I said, hey, how do I go about writing a novel? He goes, well, if you have to ask that question, you're never going to write one.
Well, I don't like teachers who discourage.
Neither did
like
that. I went home bereft. But what he was saying, as harsh as it was, probably was saying, hey, maybe you better pick another career. It's like a ballet dancer whose teacher should tell the dancer, hey, you suck.
Well, that might be, but to me there are two types of, again, this applies to other arts, but I'll say writers. There are people who are like Athena from the head of Zeus, blown, full-born. They sit down to write the first thing. It's the highest quality. They never question it. And then there are other writers, and I put myself in this group, where it's a craft laboriously achieved.
Yeah, and it's so funny because I've interviewed like 160 authors now, Nobel Prize winners, Pulitzer Prize winners, National Book Award winners, and it's really funny. I've worked 14 years on this book. I've worked 3 years on this book. The woman I interviewed last week said, yeah, I wrote it in 3 weeks. And it's like, I can't make heads or tails because I can't tell whether one's better than the other or one has literary value and one doesn't.
Okay, that's just one person, and to me there are no rules. But I will also say this. I guess stimulated by the idea I was going to have this interview, I reviewed my titles on Amazon. And my historical novel, The King's Pawn, someone gave it 5 stars. They said, this is well written, the plot has many twists and turns, let's read more Stanley Warren. And of course my ego filled the room. I got down to another work I did called My Paris, which is a combination autobiography and essays. It got 1 star. Horrible. The guy said, this blowhard. Okay. So I've learned not to pay attention to my audience. Some of them are going to be right about what I do, and some are going to be wrong. Some there's no right or wrong. It's a matter of taste, and I just follow. I am what I am, no more or less than earthly frailty can endure. I wrote in one poem.
Well, the thing about it is when I picked up the King's Pawn, and I'm expecting it. Well, I think it was when I first met you. And I picked up the King's Pawn. Well, first of all, I was worried about the format of your books because they're like 8.5 by 11. They're too big. They should be smaller, in which case I think they would sell better. But that's neither here nor there. So when I first picked it up, within the first page, I'm caught up in it. And it's really difficult to stop reading Stan's stuff because... Especially, and I'm going to concentrate more on the novels than the poetry, although the poetry is beautiful. But when you get caught up in these works right away, that's a good author. It's not like reading Gone Girl or what's the other one that's so popular? Well, even the Goldfinch or Luminaries. Those are works you have to dig into, which I'm not saying that's bad, but with Stan's, it's like you're running into it. It's not a standing start. And after a paragraph or so, you kind of say, hey, what the heck's going on? I need to find out what's going to happen on the next page. The book I was thinking of is The Rosie Project, and I interviewed the author. Yeah, and it's good and it's fun to read, but it doesn't have that same import. And I guess you could say it's the difference between literature and fiction, but I don't know. So why don't you give us a short bibliography of the novels? Because I know you want to talk about poetry, but tell us about the novels.
Okay, there are 2 historical novels. The first one is The King's Pawn. It has a subtitle, A Novel of 18th Century France, because I use the story and the character, the main character who's fictitious, as a lens for the reader to look into and experience the essence, the quality of 18th century France. The second historical novel is called Kill the Kaiser, and it covers that critical period that there's been so much written about because of the 100-year anniversary between the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand on June 28th and then the outbreak of World War I over the week of July 28th to August 4th. The premise is what drove both books, and the premises both are fictional. In The King's Pawn, it's what if the king had cultivated someone to be his personal murderer. And I took 5 prominent deaths in the reign of Louis XV and turned them fictitiously into murders. In Kill the Kaiser, it was Winston Churchill and the former chancellor of Germany getting together that if there was a world crisis, they should assassinate the Kaiser. Now I'm working on a trilogy. 2 of the books are out, available in the Wellington, by the way. One of them introduced a character who's a biology professor and animal behaviorist and gets his face ripped off by a chimp and gets a transplant. When I finished that book, I thought, boy, I wonder what would have happened to him. And the only way to find out would have been to write a sequel, which I then did, called The New Messiah, where he is mistaken in part because he's had a face transplant for the second coming. Then I said, well, gee, I want to follow him more. But I'm now working on the third one called One Long Note. And I'm going to kill him off in this one because I don't want him to keep plaguing me this way.
Well, like when you write Kill the Kaiser, and all that's written about how killing the Archduke Ferdinand had nothing to do really with World War I. It certainly wasn't the impetus, but everyone in the world thinks it is. How do you massage that into your work? So you have what's considered history. We talked about this a little bit before, and I'm saying, well, how do you know this is what happened? And so you're using as a gloss a fictional character that kind of carries you through the book and informs you of the events that are going on in that time period and also makes for an interesting narrative. But like in Kill the Kaiser, what do you do with World War I? Where do you take it? How do you start it?
Well, you understand the history of it basically through the reaction of the Kaiser to what has happened, and the notion that war was inevitable, and the notion increasing in strength that the sooner it happened for the participants, the better. To roll back in the King's Pawn, there was no real attention to the history. The attention was on the personality of Louis XV and the role of women, three royal mistresses, the Duchess of Châteauroux, Madame de Pompadour, Madame du Barry, and their impact on what happened in France.
Do you think that, do you believe, both in your writing and in reality, that most of the things that happen in the world that form the massive historical events that we talk about all the time are sparked, in a sense, by the cult of personality, by the joinder together of Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, that they wouldn't have happened but for Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, whoever you pick?
Yes and no.
Okay, well, amplify.
There are people who put their stamp on an era, but you could also say they are just as well products of the events of the era. Take Hitler, for example. No Versailles Treaty, no Hitler.
Right.
Because Hitler came to power attacking the Versailles Treaty, the war guilt clause of it. If there was no Napoleon, what would have happened? He did put his stamp on it. History would not have gone the way it did. But on the other hand, there are forces that generate these people, and they're bigger than the people.
It always fascinates me because even if you go back much further to, say, Alexander the Great, who dies when he's just basically a kid, and you talk about the library, the greatest library ever at that point in time, and the fact that we miss it so much because we don't know what was in it. I don't know. I'm fascinated with the fact that there's one person, and I see what you're saying about the time. You know, and it's the same. It's a famous adage: whether the times make the man or the man makes the times. And I don't know. I don't know what I'm asking. I'm just curious as to, do you always feel that there's an admixture of the two?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's enough of that. So talk a little bit about your educational history and some of the other trades and avocations that you found yourself in over the years.
One book we haven't mentioned is my memoir, Gone to Grass, memoir of a pothead. I'm now a non-smoking pothead. In the introduction, I said I was 5 miles wide. Someone had said this about me and to me. I was 5 miles wide and half an inch deep. And I'm very happy that it's that way. I started out to be a literature professor, and some time ago, I went into the Chester County Library with my wife, and there was a book that had come out, A Study of Hart Crane, one of my favorite poets, written by a man who was in a graduate seminar with me at Columbia, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But anyway, he had his entire life taught literature at a particular state university. And I said to my wife, that's my road not taken. And yet, as I stood there and thought about it, had all I ever done in my life was teach literature in a university, what a thin, one-dimensional life that would have been. So
Really?
I have done many things. I started out to be educated as a college professor, dropped out of college, first of all, and came back and finished, dropped out of graduate school and finished, was working in trade journalism because it was a writing job and I had no real idea where I would end up, got involved in politics. When I got involved in politics, my guy won. I became a political appointee. Then I reached a point in my life after my government time where I decided I wanted to leave New York City. And by pure chance, I ended up in Detroit, and by an even more bizarre set of circumstances, I ended up driving an ambulance for the fire department. Then I decided I wanted to go into medicine. I moved out to Oregon, decided I didn't want to go into medicine. So I guess you could say it's pretty much chance, circumstance that governed what I did.
Talk a little bit about your musical group and how it came about and the times that it came about in.
I was the public relations director for the Department of Marine and Aviation, and I was approached by Charlotte Moorman, who had gained fame as a topless cellist. And she had an avant-garde arts festival, and she asked if she could hold this year's festival, which was 68 or 67. And I said yes. And as the official in charge, I was told by the commissioner I could shut the whole thing down if it got out of hand. While I was on the ferry, there were these musicians playing this music like I'd never heard. We know it as the Moog synthesizer, but Simeon, his name is, had his own jerry-built version of that and played this incredibly intense music. Then, strictly by chance, within a few days, a friend of mine, a photographer, told me he heard about this group. Would I like to meet them? And so I got to listen to them.
And then you became their lyricist, I assume.
Because I wrote an essay about them that never got published, but flattered them very much. And they started socializing with me and coming out to my Queens apartment, eating my then wife's great hors d'oeuvres. And I showed them by then I had started writing poetry, and I showed them some stuff, and they looked at one, and they liked it and said, "Can I put this to music?" And then, as they say, the rest is history. They did 7 of their 9 cuts using poems of mine.
Well, let's talk a little bit about not only with your poetry, but with your novels. Granted, they're on Amazon now, but you and I spoke a little bit before, and we've talked about it in the store, too, about, I don't know, it's not like what you want your legacy to be, but it does go to the fact that you can't not write. And, you know, you've jokingly, half in jest, as we've talked about, said that you're going to be famous posthumously. And how do you feel about that, and why is that enough for you? Or is it enough?
And as I think in one of our initial conversations, what does it matter whether there are 50 people on Earth or 500 or 500 million who enjoy and appreciate your talent, and you have been able to move their emotions, which is the fundamental definition of beauty. The idea of being blessed to create beauty, how many people do you have to say that was beautiful to? And when you become famous, and I had a taste of this with my music, and by the way, that group is called Silver Apples, and the musician Simeon is performing today and playing some of our stuff still. In order to get that, you lose your privateness, your personal life, and I was unwilling to do that.
Well, you continued to write. You're writing today. We've talked about the trilogy. And is it really just, we talked about it almost in a defecatory sense, and I said more of a purgative sense, not purgatory, purgative sense, and something like there's a pressure that builds up in you, and it has to be relieved, and you relieve it through this, through the writing. So I guess what you're saying, and I think young people especially won't understand this, especially because, one, they're not going to be reading books or poetry.
Amen.
And the second thing is because they want to be famous. They want to be retired when they graduate college. They want to be wearing white shoes, white belts in Miami Beach playing golf and buying mutual funds.
I have to say this. I went to Hofstra University when it was Hofstra College. I entered in the fall of '56 as a 16-year-old freshman. There was another individual who was 16 who entered college with me. He was in my very first class I ever went to, our English 1. And he said, when I grow up, I'm going to be a Hollywood director and make movie history. And we laughed. We said, sure, Franny. Franny was Francis Ford Coppola. To him, to be famous was as important as to create the works. But if he had done The Godfather or Apocalypse Now, and only a limited audience had seen it, would that detract at all from the value of the work?
I can't honestly answer that. I mean, I have a friend who's a cardiologist, and he knew he wanted to be a cardiologist from the age of 6. So he achieved his goal. I wish I wish I still now had a goal like that, where I knew exactly what it was and I wanted to achieve it. And because I wanted it so bad, I had to follow the rules and do everything I could to achieve that goal. And it's like you kind of do and you kind of don't have that goal in your own life, and you've lived a long life.
Well, again, between 1988 and 1990, I had a column in the Daily Local News. In 1988, there was new management, and they felt they should feature local writers because the word local was in the paper's title. And for 2 years, I wrote. There was an audience out there. I had a lady, after I wrote an article about the breakup of Yugoslavia, and she said, the world is a better place because you're walking on Earth. Again, how much of that do you need?
Well, that's a good point, because if you're writing for the Daily Local and have an extremely limited audience, but you're writing important things about, suppose you're writing about Serbia and Bosnia and the conflict there and what, or the Berlin Wall or whatever, isn't it important then to be talking to the world, like FDR's fireside chats or William Murrow? Don't you find the need, because you have so many ideas, because you have so many causes? Isn't there ever arise in you this need to be heard by everybody?
Well, it depends on how you define everybody. As it happened right here in Westchester, just a few blocks from here, I met a most extraordinary individual named Bob Jones from Coatesville, who had a vision of a cultural society in Coatesville, whose function, whose purpose was to bring people. He originally had said all races together, A-R-T, through art, but it's expanded really, of all cultures, of all kinds of people, to bring them together through the medium of art. And I have been active creatively even before the Coatesville Society, Cultural Society, formally existed. People come there. Their audiences in total might be 100. They appreciate my work. They get a lot out of it. How many people do I need to have that happen to?
I understand exactly what you're saying. It's just hard for me to wrap my head around because the rest of the world isn't like you. I mean, you're still playing, you're still singing, you're still acting. You're doing all the things that you want to do. I guess the problem is that you don't really have an ego. I don't know. Do you?
Oh boy, do I have an ego!
Well, who is it that's going to be massaging your ego on a daily basis? There should be somebody.
Well, and there is. You know, they're my dogs. God love them. They think I'm wonderful.
That's so funny. I mean, it really is. And we've talked about this so many times at the store, and it's a pleasure for you to come in and bring books that you've enjoyed and give them back to the store. But it's always been in a situation where, yes, I'm writing this, I'm writing that, but it's never with an intent to hire an agent and go to Random House, go to Penguin, and have these books published. It's nice that you're on Amazon, but like I said, I think it would be nicer if you had a broader audience. But enough of that. Why don't you read another poem?
This is a poem which seems to eschew art. It's called In the Dead of Winter. It's about my brother-in-law, who back in the days of getting high, they approached me and my sister and brother-in-law and said, we'd like to try this marijuana stuff. And as it happened, I had some Vietnamese marijuana. The only time I had it was very strong. And my brother-in-law went into this trip, no other word for it, where he said, I hate advertising, I want to paint. And in fact, he started painting. So I wrote this for him. His name was Stephen C. Bowman. In the dead of winter. The paint, though still bright on the palette, has cracked and dried, and I have had my fill of words like unused brushes, stiff and unyielding. Out my window all is yet unformed. The slow seep of water has not reached the seed to split its hull with promise. But spring will come again to rouse the trees and tint my pallid dreams in colors brighter than the shades I use to taint my memory. Covered by the snow, a newer canvas waits the touch of brushes freshened by the sun, and rain reminds me not to grieve for what is gone and what is yet to leave. One of my favorites.
Me too. I like it because it gives me like an out for the things I haven't done in my life. You're saying to me, hey, don't worry about it. It's okay. You still got all this time left.
Oobla dee, oobla da, life goes on.
Yeah, I actually just saw this show in New York called Looking Through a Glass Onion, and it's like a retrospective of John Lennon's work. So it's 34 of his songs, and I guess Paul's too, interspersed with his own narrative about his life. Wasn't as good as your stuff, but it was good.
Bless you. I still miss him.
Me too. He was my hero.
As a matter of fact, you've told me that this show is going to air December 8th.
Which was the day he died.
The day he died.
Monday Night Football, Howard Cosell interrupted. I had my 2-month-old son. I was sitting on a rocking chair with him crying.
And actually, it also is Buddha's Enlightenment Day.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
He sat down under the Bo tree on December 1st and got up December 8th.
Yeah. That's interesting because we were talking about, I don't know, we've been talking about spiritual things for a good part of this 33 minutes. But what do you think about, how do you classify yourself in terms of a spiritual person? Do you consider yourself perhaps a Buddhist?
I'm a stereotype, a Jewish Buddhist.
A Jubu.
Right. Buddha said that to try and determine the nature of God was fruitless. He said it would be like having a poisoned arrow in your bloodstream and someone comes to pull it out and you say, wait, before I let you pull out the arrow, I want to know, is it a man or a woman who fired the arrow, young or old, a dark or light, blue-eyed or brown-eyed? He said the idea is to pull out the arrow. He said his closest definition of God was this being that arises. And whatever brought this cosmos into existence, for me, is God. I'm also a Buddhist in the sense that I think the Buddha's worldview and view of humanity and what it was to be a person was spot on. But I'm not a Buddhist. I have never... I don't sit and meditate, and you cannot be a Buddhist unless you meditate.
Of course, you know, the other side of the coin is that you meditate and nothing happens. That's the whole idea. So, and it's like Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche and Shambhala Publications, you know, it's a very easy thing to accomplish, which is, you know, you're in a parachute, you're falling to the ground, the chute's open, you're doing fine, and all he's asking you to do is cut the lines. And very few people can do it, but if you cut those lines and separate yourself from the ego that we were talking about, you know, then you become a bodhisattva.
We all are bodhisattvas. We all are totally, fully enlightened. We just don't know it.
Well, we know it when we're Buddha babies. We don't really know it. We just are it. And then
exactly.
And then comes the other. And as soon as the other comes, you lose that Buddha-ness.
I expressed it this way. I call this gatha, which means teaching. Rain drips off the roof just as I walk by. Water wets my face. Buddha wipes my eye.
Yeah, that's better than I expressed it.
I'd like to talk a little bit about women also.
I was going to ask you about sex because your novels contain lots of sex, and you actually brought a Henry Miller book by. And when I look at, we talked about this too because I don't really like his sexual imagery because it's not pleasant. It's generally, I don't know. And yours is different. And we'll talk about it. Why am I talking? You talk.
Well,
about
I'd like to talk about it through my poetry. I think here's the basis of it. It's a poem called Ogle. It was written when I was walking down Fifth Avenue to Washington Square, and I was behind a rather entrancing pair of twitching buttocks. And I noticed as someone walked by the other way, a man, he jerked his head, and then he turned to look. And this poem is called Ogle. How greedily male eyes are drawn to gaze at female butts. He can no more keep his head from turning as she walks past than not to breathe. So does nature dictate this subtle play of stare and sway, linked by hunger of flesh for itself, divine dance, replication, time and again spun out on this mortal stage.
So much of this, I think, and of course it does sound sexist, is hardwired in men. And a lot of
Absolutely.
And there's nothing you can do about it. When a woman walks by, it's either kind of a 1 or a 0 in binary code. And someone was talking about ogling, and they called it oogling the other day, and I said, no, it's not oogling. And I always like the word calipagus describing buttocks. It's one of my favorite words.
Well,
Calipagian.
But also, as I've expounded at length in a number of places in my writings, men and women are like a binary star system. And the women are the alphas and the men are the betas. The women are 50 times, the alpha star is 50 times greater than the beta star. And incidentally, the female ovum is 50 times greater than the sperm. And I can go on and on at that, but I won't, but I just want to share a moment when I realized this with full force. This is called Monday morning meeting. They sit in coats and ties, white-shirted arbiters of their own corporate destiny, with token, nylon-skirted female, dangling wicked shoe from shapely devilish foot, who draws male minds from all thought of profit to be gained, gladly sacrificed for just one moment on their knees in front of she whose power far outstrips their puny, moneyed games.
I know. It's like when I was doing trial work in Florida during the 30-some years that I've done it, it always bothered me so much when I was up against a nice-looking woman, because if the jury was composed primarily of men, there's no way that I could prevail against, as you said, the clicking of high heel, stiletto heels, as she would get up to make her closing argument. It's almost impossible. It's just one of those things. We have I'll give you some of my time for next week. You got 1 minute and 30 seconds left, so make the best of it.
Well, how about reading Hydrogen?
Okay.
So I would bathe in hydrogen my soul-wrenched mind, from ether drawn to dusty nucleus expands. A flower fills the void with universe. In chains each molecule from unassembled glory blossoms fire in the darkness, shifting, blue, red. Wonder outruns grasp. Uncomprehending awe swells emptiness with hydrogen to spin my destiny. Infusion whirls each atom of itself in self-led combination with itself arises. Elemental cluster bursts. Electric pollen swirls about the calyx, curls about the cosmos, leaks its honey into nothing sweetened by itself. O hydrogen, your gassy petals flourish still. They spread and surge across the empty field. Unnullified, my vision leaps and dances in the night. I wrap myself in hydrogen, subsume each instant. Energy retains my form, decays. Each moment builds an edifice, must tumble down, to hydrogen return, its gift let out. Renewal of each wavicle I sing, until again in hydrogen relive an unmined destiny. Enumerate the journey out. Within I wander aimlessly, without I wander aimlessly. Within, without a goal I cannot reach, already there, in hydrogen sustained. My cry of worship, Holy flower, reach into the void, and on your petals bear each stroke of accident we named the universe. Is naught but you, O hydrogen. Your own creation shimmers softly, but one moment, then is gone. I love you, hydrogen.
I guess we have to love hydrogen. And in both the literal and the figurative sense, that was a very elemental poem.
It's my Mount Everest.
Yeah, I mean, it is there, and without it, we wouldn't have, as Carl Sagan, been expelled from stars as star stuff into heavier elements.
There you go.
That's pretty much it, what you said. So that's a great way to end it. Stanley, like I said, I'll keep saying it, whether you listen or not. But I mean, I've had all these interviews, and this is as good or better than almost all of them because one, your poetry is so damn good, and two, because you're more articulate than most of the people I interview. So thank you very much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
And thanks for the opportunity and the kind words.
You're welcome. So, in any event, join us next week on The Avid Reader for what is another, hopefully, as insightful and engaging discussion as we've had today. We have, because of Rebecca, my producer, a whole list of potential upcoming authors. In the old days, I used to tell you who was coming up, but no longer can I do that because we have so many people who might be. But you can always visit WellingtonSquareBooks.com, WCHE1520.com, or download our podcast at iTunes or Podomatic. And with that, I think I'm coming up on my 43 minutes because you have a Buffalo station that's going to come in now and take over the airways because they have 50,000 watts and you only have 5,000. So in any event, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you'll be here next week for another author. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Avid Reader Show with your host, Sam Hankin. Sam will be back next week with reviews and interviews of some of the more interesting books and authors of today.